Let's take a look at a few beat-em-ups. In 1993, Final Fight 2 hit the Super Nintendo, and unlike the first title, this version didn't actually see an arcade release. After defeating the Mad Gear, life in Metro City has returned to normal. That is, until the Mad Gear, under the guidance of a new leader, kidnaps Guy's fiancée, along with her father and Guy's former sensei. Strangely, Guy is missing from the game, with only Hagar returning from the first title, alongside newcomers Carlos and Maki. Each player controls a bit differently, with Hagar being slower but more powerful, while the other two are quicker but don't inflict as much damage. The gameplay remains the same here, with one attack button and one jump button. Pressing these together will result in a special attack, and while these are more powerful than standard moves, they also sacrifice a small portion of your player's health. Whereas Final Fight took place on the streets of Metro City, this game takes 2 different locations around the world with 6 stages in total. You can even spot Chun-Li in the background of the Hong Kong stage, which is a nice little Easter egg. Visually, the Final Fight games have always been the best looking beat-em-ups of the 16-bit era in my opinion, and this one is no exception. With large characters and colorful backgrounds that aren't as repetitive as other games in the genre, it's easy to see why the series was recognized as one of the best looking. Just like other games in the genre, the biggest challenge of the game are the boss battles. Where the standard enemies in the game are pretty easy to plow through with little strategy, these bosses usually fight using a specific pattern that needs to be memorized to master. I will say that I feel like this game is a little easier than its predecessor, though the difficulty option can be increased up to Expert, which is the only way the full ending can be viewed. While Final Fight for the SNES is still relatively cheap, Final Fight 2 usually goes for around $50 or more, but you can typically find the Super Famicom version for less than $20. For huge fans of the genre like me, this one is a must-have. In 1995, Final Fight 3 hit the Super Nintendo, and once again, the game was developed specifically for the SNES with no arcade version being released. This game marks the return of Guy, as well as Hagar, whose height keeps changing between games for some reason, and 2 all-new players to the franchise. The fight returns to Metro City as a new threat. The Skull Cross Gang has taken over the streets. This time around, a lot of the gameplay mechanics have been updated and improved. New to the series is the ability to dash, which is performed by double tapping in either direction. Also new is the inclusion of special moves and super moves. The special moves are performed similar to fighting games like Street Fighter, as well are the super moves, which require a meter to be filled before you can perform them. You only have a certain amount of time to pull off one of these moves once your super meter has been filled, as it will default back to being empty after a while. As well as standard single-player and 2-player co-op mode, a player also has the option to have a computer-controlled ally fight along their side. Graphically, the game looks even better than before, with more detailed sprites and even livelier backgrounds, and Hagar even sports a nice little new ponytail mullet. The game also features different endings based on the character you complete the game with, as well as difficulty settings. This one is even more expensive than Final Fight 2, so if you want to own a copy, be prepared to spend around $100, but this, along with Final Fight 2, can also be had on the Wii and the Wii U Virtual Console. Sonic Blast Man 2 was released on the Super Nintendo in 1994. With 3 characters to choose from, you'll find your typical formula of quick, balanced, and powerful here, along with a jump button and a standard attack button, which are quicker and used to create combos. There's also a secondary attack button, which allows one stronger attack, allowing for a lot more variation in gameplay. Also new is the inclusion of a second ultimate attack, giving the player an option to conserve power and use the slightly less powerful version or go all out with the more powerful attack. Returning is the ability to perform different sets of combos depending on which directional buttons are pressed in combination with attack. But the addition of the running attacks and the ability to avoid enemy strikes with the new roll technique is what really makes the gameplay feel more tailored to hardcore gamers. There's also a 2-player mode now featured, which, in my opinion, is a necessity for a beat-em-up. Visually, I think this game takes a step backwards. The first game featured larger sprites and more detailed enemies. With that being said, I think the character model for Sonic Blastman looks better despite being smaller. This is another title that's quite expensive these days, and unlike the Final Fight games, it's not that much cheaper on the Super Famicom. Brawl Brothers was the second game in the Rushing Beat series behind rival Turf and was released in Japan in 1992 and the rest of the world the following year in 93. There are a total of 5 playable characters, all with their own unique moves and attributes like speed and power. The game plays like any standard beat-em-up with a button for attack, jump, and special, which drains a small portion of your player's health. There's also a double tap dash that can be paired with an attack and a taunt that's pretty much useless. Brawl Brothers brings some innovative features to the genre, including an angry mode that grants your player a short period of invincibility after he or she has taken a considerable amount of damage. You can also pick up food items that restore health, but what makes this unique here is the ability to carry the food around with you, giving the option of when and where you want to consume it. Though there aren't a whole lot of stages, the game will still seem a bit long due to the largeness of these levels. A lot of these stages also feature interactive situations as well, most of which are hazards to avoid. While I'm a big fan of the gameplay here, it is important to note that it's not perfect. Hit detection can become a problem at times, as enemies need to be aligned almost perfectly to make contact. Also, stages can sometimes become maze-like, with the player having to find the correct way to the end. This, however, wasn't included in the Japanese version, and oddly enough, the Japanese version can be played here in the American version by using a cheat code. While I did enjoy the visuals in Rival Turf, I'd have to say I like them even more here. Everything is more colorful and feels almost cartoonish. On top of all this, the game's soundtrack is top-notch, and if you're like me and you played this a lot as a kid, these songs will bring back a lot of memories. I got my copy complete in box a few years back for $30 or so, but it has gone up a bit, so if you plan on picking up a copy, don't wait too long. The Mighty Morphin Power Rangers hit the SNES in 1994. There was also a Genesis version, which was more of a fighting game and was completely different from the Super Nintendo release, which was more of a beat-em-up. You select from one of the 5 Rangers and hit the streets to take out the putties. You'll start out using the civilian version of whatever Ranger you selected, with attacks limited to punches and kicks. As each stage progresses, you'll eventually reach a point where your player will automatically morph into a Power Ranger. Once this form takes effect, a player will now have a whole new set of attacks available, including the ability to strike with weapons. The player also now has access to a special bomb attack that can only be used once but is extremely powerful. There are also stages in the game that let the player fight as the Megazord. I like the level designs, though the graphics are a little on the simple side with smaller sprites featuring little detail. The gameplay can become a little repetitive, especially since the fighter is only given a single plane to fight in. But I can't stress enough how good the music is here. I mean, it's almost Street Fighter-esque. The following year, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie was released. In addition to the White Ranger being added to the game, the Red, Black, and Yellow Rangers have been replaced with the new characters from the movie. There are 7 stages in total, with the main villain from the movie, Ivan Ooze, appearing as the game's final boss. The game plays a lot like the previous title, with a player starting as his or her civilian persona, progressing through the stages while taking out enemies. Only this time, instead of automatically morphing into a ranger during a boss battle, a player can now morph after the morphing meter has been filled. This can be filled by picking up Thunderbolt items which are dropped by enemies. These can also be used for special attacks. New here is a 2-plane system in which the player can jump back and forth between, giving a little more depth to the gameplay. The Death and Return of Superman was released on the Super Nintendo in 1994 and the Sega Genesis in 1995. You'll take control of not only Superman but also the likes of Superboy and Steel, among others, but instead of a character select screen like most beat-em-ups, each character is pre-selected for the player based on level. The button layout consists of a basic hand-to-hand combat attack, a projectile attack, and a special attack which is powerful but limited. Your player also has the ability to fly by double tapping the jump button. This will be necessary in specific stages as certain enemies will remain in the air for combat. The enemies are a bit on the difficult side at times as they tend to double team the player quite frequently, leaving you sandwiched between 2 foes. There are also environmental hazards to avoid in certain stages, which can be tough to avoid at times while also trying to avoid enemies. Along with the standard combat levels come some shooter stages. In these levels, the player can fly forward and back as well as up and down. Enemies will gather on screen while shooting projectiles, which the player must avoid while also returning fire. While I prefer a more colorful game, I understand that the darker tone of the story needs to reflect in the game's visuals. I think the character models look really good and the backgrounds for the most part are nice, though they sometimes lack a little bit of detail. Unfortunately, this is another game that's gonna run you about $50 or so, but if you're a big Superman fan, it just might be worth it.